The room was filled with some of the most dangerous men on the planet. Navy SEALs, Marine Raiders, Army Special Forces operators, warriors who had seen things that never made the news, men who had buried brothers and kept moving forward anyway. They sat in that dim briefing room with the kind of silence that only comes from people who have nothing left to prove. The SEAL captain standing at the front of the room had a voice like gravel and steel, the kind of voice that had given orders under enemy fire and never once cracked. He scanned the room slowly, his eyes moving across every face with the precision of a man who had spent decades reading people in seconds. Then he asked the question no one expected. He said, "Any combat pilots here? Anyone with actual time in the cockpit over a hot zone?" And for a moment, nobody moved. The operators exchanged glances. A few shifted in their seats. Because everyone in that room assumed they already knew who was going to stand up, and they assumed it was going to be one of them. But then, from the far left side of the room, in the second row, a single figure rose quietly to her feet. She didn't make a sound. She didn't announce herself. She simply stood. And every head in that room turned. Because standing there, calm and steady in her flight suit, was a woman. And the look on her face said everything her voice didn't need to. What happened next would challenge every assumption in that room and rewrite what these warriors thought they knew about courage. Do you believe that the most dangerous person in the room is always who you expect it to be? Her name was Lieutenant Commander Maya Reeves, and she had not spent a single day of her adult life trying to be remarkable. She had spent every single one of those days trying to be ready. That distinction mattered more than most people understood, and it had shaped everything about who she was by the time she walked into that briefing room at the age of 34. Maya grew up in Pensacola, Florida, which meant she had grown up watching jets slice across the sky with a frequency that most people would take for granted. But she never did. From the time she was 7 years old, she would stand in her backyard with her hand shading her eyes and track every aircraft she could see until it disappeared completely into the horizon. Her father was a retired Navy chief, not a pilot, but a man who understood what it meant to serve something larger than yourself. Her mother was a registered nurse who worked double shifts at Sacred Heart Hospital and still managed to cook dinner most nights. Neither of them told Maya what to be. Both of them showed her how to work. She was not the fastest kid in her class or the most naturally gifted athlete. What she had was something harder to teach and harder to maintain, a willingness to stay in the room when everything inside her told her to leave. She learned that about herself during her first year at the Naval Academy, when the physical and academic pressure of plebe summer broke people around her every single week. She watched people who had been high school phenoms, all-state athletes and valedictorians, pack their bags and walk away. She did not judge them. She simply made a decision every morning to remain. She told herself that the decision didn't have to feel good. It just had to be made. By her second year at Annapolis, she had found her direction in aviation and pursued it with a discipline that her instructors noticed and quietly respected. She was methodical, exacting, and unusually self-aware for someone her age, always asking what she had done wrong before asking what she had done right. She graduated with distinction in aerospace engineering and earned her slot in naval flight training at NAS Whiting Field, where the real work began. Flight training was its own education entirely, a sustained test of cognitive load, physical coordination, decision-making under pressure, and the ability to stay emotionally regulated when the cockpit told you things you didn't want to hear. Maya absorbed all of it. She didn't just learn to fly. She learned to think while flying, to problem solve while her body was being pulled in 3 directions and her instruments were painting a complicated picture. Her instructors later said she had what they called situational patience, a rare quality in young pilots, meaning she could process a rapidly deteriorating situation without letting panic eat into her decision-making time. That quality would one day save lives. But at this point in her journey, she was still proving herself one flight at a time, still building the foundation that would eventually carry her into the most demanding combat environments the Navy could offer. Her first deployment was to the Persian Gulf aboard the USS Theodore Roosevelt, and it stripped away every romantic notion she had ever held about what operational service actually looked like from the inside. The days were brutally long, the work was relentless, and the emotional isolation of being one of a small number of women in a combat aviation squadron required a kind of internal management that no training syllabus had ever formally addressed. She flew the F/A-18 Super Hornet, a machine that demanded total physical and mental commitment every single time you strapped into it, and she flew it well. Her section lead during that first deployment was a veteran pilot named Commander Travis Hollis, a man who had over 2,000 flight hours and an ego that he had earned through hard experience. He was not unkind to Maya, but he was not easy on her either, which was ultimately the right call and something she came to respect deeply. He held her to the same standard he held every other pilot under his supervision: no adjustments, no accommodations, no soft feedback. She made mistakes, as all young pilots do, and he corrected them directly and moved on. What she found was that being held to the same standard was not something to resent. It was something to be grateful for, because it meant she was being treated as a pilot first, and every correction made her sharper. Her second deployment raised the stakes significantly. She was assigned to support operations in Afghanistan, flying close air support missions in support of ground forces operating in some of the most complex terrain on Earth. Close air support was a different emotional world from air-to-air combat. You were operating directly over friendly troops, often in environments where the margin between a successful strike and a catastrophic mistake was measured in meters and seconds. The weight of that responsibility was something Maya carried consciously on every single flight. She became known in her squadron for her communication discipline on the radio, for the clarity and precision of her transmissions during active engagements, and for her willingness to abort a run if the targeting picture was not clean enough to guarantee the safety of the troops on the ground. Some younger pilots saw abort decisions as failures. Maya understood them as exactly the opposite. Aborting a run that carried risk to friendlies was not timidity. It was the exercise of professional judgment under pressure, which was the entire point of putting a trained human being in that cockpit instead of an automated system. Over the course of that deployment, she logged dozens of combat missions and earned the respect of the ground units who had worked with her overhead. Radio calls from Joint Terminal Attack Controllers, the special operators who coordinated air strikes from the ground, began to specifically request her call sign when air support was available. That was not a formal metric that appeared in any official evaluation. But in the community of people who did this kind of work, it meant everything. The morning of the mission that would change the trajectory of her career began like most significant mornings do, unremarkably. There was no dramatic music, no cinematic forewarning. There was pre-dawn darkness, a cold briefing room, stale coffee, and a mission package that had been thrown together quickly because the situation on the ground had changed overnight. A special operations task force was conducting a sensitive site exploitation mission in a remote valley in eastern Afghanistan, and the intelligence picture had shifted significantly in the previous 6 hours. What had been a low-threat environment had become something considerably more complicated, and the ground force commander needed dedicated close air support overhead before he was willing to push his element forward. Maya was slated to fly as section lead on the mission with a junior pilot named Lieutenant Jake Mercer on her wing. Mercer was good, technically sound, mentally tough, and eager in the way that young pilots need to be eager, but he had not yet accumulated the combat hours she had. And the weight of section lead responsibility settled onto Maya's shoulders with familiar gravity. The flight out to station was quiet. She ran through her checks with the precision of someone who understood that ritual and preparation were not superstition. They were the architecture of performance. When they established their orbit over the operational area, the radio immediately came alive with the controlled urgency of a ground force working a dynamic situation. The JTAC, who identified himself by his call sign, communicated a threat picture that was evolving faster than the original plan had anticipated. There were armed personnel maneuvering toward the ground force's position from 2 separate directions. The terrain was broken and visually complex, and the ground force was beginning to take sporadic fire from elevated positions to the northeast. Maya processed the information calmly, cross-referenced her targeting system with the coordinates being passed from the ground, and built a mental picture of the engagement space that she continuously updated as new information arrived. What she would have to do in the next several minutes required not just technical skill, but the ability to make high-consequence decisions faster than her conscious mind could fully analyze every variable, and to make those decisions correctly. The first run she made was precise. The threat to the northeast was neutralized, and the ground forces radio traffic shifted from urgent to controlled, which was exactly the kind of feedback that told her the immediate crisis had been addressed. But the second threat vector required a different approach, and the terrain constraints meant the weapons options were significantly more limited. She talked it through with the JTAC in real time, adjusting, problem-solving, never raising her voice, never letting the pressure of the moment compress her communication into the kind of shorthand that causes misunderstandings. When the mission was over and the ground force was safe, she flew back to the ship in silence, running through every decision she had made, looking for anything she would do differently. That kind of honest self-examination was not self-punishment. It was professional maintenance. It was how she stayed sharp. The recognition that followed her combat performance came quietly and through channels that mattered more than any public acknowledgement. The special operations community communicated its assessments through informal networks, through the trust economy that governs relationships between air assets and ground forces, and through the simple fact of being asked for by name. That request pattern caught the attention of her commanding officer, who recommended her for an inter-service coordination role that would embed her with a special operations task force for a period of several months. It was unusual. It was not the standard career path for an F/A-18 pilot of her experience level, and it placed her in environments and conversations that most naval aviators never encountered. This was the context in which she found herself, weeks later, walking into that briefing room and sitting in the second row while a SEAL captain assessed his assembled team for capabilities. The task force was preparing for an operation that required an air component with both combat experience and the ability to integrate fluidly with ground forces who operated by a very different rhythm than conventional military units. The SEAL captain, a man named Captain David Okafor, had a reputation that preceded him through every corridor of the special operations world. He was direct, brilliant, and completely indifferent to anyone's rank unless that rank was backed by demonstrated competence. He had seen too many coordination failures caused by people who were impressive on paper and inadequate in practice. When he asked for combat pilots and Maya rose to her feet, the room's reaction was immediate and human. Surprise, assessment. The instinctive recalibration that happens when reality does not match expectation. Okafor looked at her for a moment, not with condescension and not with performed enthusiasm, with the same evaluative gaze he had turned on every other person in that room. Then he asked her a direct question, specifically about her experience coordinating with ground forces in contested environments. She answered directly, without padding her response with qualifiers or apologies for taking up space. She gave him what he asked for, information. Okafor nodded once. He moved on. That nod was not a small thing. In the currency of that environment, it was a full endorsement. What followed was a 3-week integration process during which Maya had to earn her place not through argument or advocacy, but through daily demonstration. The SEAL operators were professional in their skepticism. They held her to exactly the standards they held everyone else, which meant the bar was exceptionally high and the patience for performance gaps was exceptionally thin. She did not always get everything right. There were planning sessions where she had to ask for clarification on ground force tactics. She was still learning, and she asked those questions directly and without embarrassment. Because pretending to know something she didn't know was a form of professional dishonesty that could translate into operational risk. The operators noticed that too. Asking the right questions at the right time, it turned out, was its own form of competence. The joint operation itself unfolded over 48 hours in a remote mountainous region where communication was difficult, the weather was unpredictable, and the intelligence picture remained fluid throughout. Maya's role was to serve as the airborne component lead, coordinating the air assets, supporting the ground team, while remaining in continuous communication with Okafor's command element and the JTACs embedded with the assault force. It was the most complex operational environment she had ever worked in, not because any single element was beyond her capability, but because the integration of all those elements simultaneously demanded a level of cognitive and emotional performance that tested everything she had built over the previous decade. There was a moment, roughly 14 hours into the operation, when the weather deteriorated rapidly and the ground force found itself in a position where the planned exfiltration route was no longer viable. Okafor made the call to hold in place and wait for a weather window, but the holding position was not ideal, and the air support overhead needed to be managed carefully to maintain both presence and fuel discipline. Maya spent the next 4 hours running a continuous coordination loop between the aircraft on station, the ground elements changing needs, and the weather data coming in from multiple sources, making real-time decisions about which assets to keep overhead, when to push aircraft to the tanker, and how to maintain the coverage pattern that gave the ground force the protection it needed. She did not sleep during those 4 hours. She worked. And when the weather broke and the extraction was executed successfully, with the entire ground force returning to the forward operating base without a single casualty, the debriefing was quiet and professional and thorough. Okafor ran the debrief himself, as he always did, moving through the operation chronologically and asking hard questions about every decision point. When he reached the weather hold phase and the air coordination decisions, he walked through them methodically and then stated plainly that the air management during that window had been executed correctly and had directly contributed to the mission's success. He said it once, factually, and moved on to the next item. There was no ceremony in it. There was also no ambiguity. The operators in the room registered it. For Maya, that moment carried a weight that she would return to many times in the years ahead, not because she needed the validation, but because of what it represented about the nature of genuine professional respect. It was not given in advance. It was not assumed. It was earned through sustained performance in conditions that did not care about your background, your gender, your rank, or your reputation. It only cared about what you actually did when the situation was real, and the pressure was real, and the consequences were real. She had done the work for years before anyone in that briefing room had ever heard her name. The recognition was simply the delayed arrival of something she had already built. When Maya returned to the carrier after her attachment to the task force concluded, she found that the experience had changed her in ways she was still processing. She had always been a disciplined officer and a skilled pilot, but the 3 months embedded with the special operations community had exposed her to a level of operational integration and adaptive decision-making that recalibrated her understanding of what excellence actually required. She was different in the debrief rooms now, more comfortable with ambiguity, more willing to say out loud when a plan had a weakness that needed addressing rather than hoping the weakness would resolve itself under execution pressure. She had learned that from watching operators who treated honesty about risk as a professional obligation rather than a sign of weakness or pessimism. She was also more patient with junior pilots and officers who were still finding their footing. She remembered what it had felt like to be the least experienced person in the room. And she understood that the way a senior leader treats someone who is still developing either builds or destroys that person's capacity to grow. She had been fortunate enough to have leaders who built rather than destroyed, and she took that responsibility seriously when the dynamic reversed. Her commanding officer recommended her for promotion, and her performance evaluations reflected not just her combat record, but her leadership development and her ability to operate effectively across organizational boundaries. The promotion to commander came through, and with it, a set of responsibilities that shifted her from primarily executing missions to primarily shaping the conditions under which others could execute them well. She found that transition harder than she had expected, not because she was unprepared intellectually, but because leading others required a kind of sustained emotional investment that flying alone in a cockpit had never demanded from her. You could be exceptionally disciplined about your own performance without ever fully confronting your limitations in how you communicated, motivated, and supported other people. Leadership forced that confrontation. She accepted it the same way she had accepted every other hard thing, as something that needed to be done, regardless of how it felt. She also became one of the senior officers asked to speak to incoming classes of female naval aviators, and what she told them was never what they expected to hear. She didn't tell them that the path would become easier or that the culture had been completely transformed. She told them that the path was genuinely hard, that the standards were high for everyone, and that the best way to navigate that reality was to invest everything you had into your actual competence. Because competence was the only currency that consistently cleared the barriers in front of them. She told them to ask questions without apology, to make decisions without waiting for permission, and to earn the respect they deserved through the work they were willing to do every single day. She told them that some rooms would go quiet when they walked in, and that the right response to that quiet was not to shrink, but to simply stand. Maya Reeves never set out to become a symbol. She set out to become the best combat pilot she was capable of being. And she pursued that goal with a consistency and a discipline that accumulated over years into something no single moment could fully contain. The image of her rising quietly from that chair in a room full of special operators became a story that spread through military circles, not because it was miraculous, but because it was true, and because it reflected something that people recognized as important even when they struggled to articulate exactly why. She rose because she had earned the right to rise. Because every flight hour she had logged, every mission she had flown, every hard conversation she had stayed in, every correction she had accepted and integrated, every early morning she had shown up when fatigue told her to rest, all of it had converged into a person who could stand in the hardest rooms without flinching. The lesson her story carries is not really about gender, though her experience as a woman in a male-dominated profession is real and should not be minimized. The deeper lesson is about what it means to build yourself honestly over time, to resist the shortcuts that feel good in the moment but hollow out the foundation you need when the real test arrives. It is about choosing preparation over comfort, standard over convenience, and integrity over self-protection. It is about understanding that respect is not owed to anyone. It is constructed, piece by piece, through demonstrated reliability in the moments that matter. Maya would tell you herself that she is not exceptional in the way the word is often used. She is disciplined. She is honest. She is relentless in the right ways and patient in the right ways. And she is living proof that the most powerful thing any person can do when a room falls silent and all eyes turn toward them in doubt is to simply remain standing, calm, prepared, and completely ready for whatever comes next. That is the story, and it belongs to every person who has ever stood up in a room that didn't expect them.